He's a boss. He's ready. All right. Well, we have a standing room only crowd. This is an experiment. It's the first event of some series of speakers that we'd like to run as alumni over the fall and winter. I'm curious, how many of you came to college primarily because you expect the college to help you get a good job when you're done? So that's pretty much all of it. I mean, naturally, the survey works out at least 70% of kids go to college to get a good job. And if you go in and talk to employers and you ask them how they're doing in hiring kids out of school, they'll tell you it's not so good. You probably, Dartmouth doesn't have as hard a problem placement as some schools, but the employers aren't real happy with what's coming out of the college. And if you ask them what they're mainly looking for, they say they want people with good problem-solving skills, good critical thinking, and good communication skills. Sometimes they'll throw in leadership and field work and team collaboration, right? And if you ask them, how many of you think that you're getting it? It's about 11%. And if you ask people in the colleges, do you think you're doing a good job teaching problem solving, critical thinking, and communication? They all say we're doing a great job. So there's clearly a mismatch. And so that's probably the root challenge that we're trying to take on with this series. So this is trying some of our technology, trying some of our speakers, seeing what kind of uptake there is, what kind of interest there is, and some sessions to start to think about that. One of the reasons we decided to do it with fraternities is A, we won't have so much oversight from the administration. Not that we're doing anything bad, but we can do what we want to do. And number two, most of us are fraternity and sorority people ourselves. And our pretty much uniform testimony is that we probably learn more about critical thinking and problem solving communication skills in fraternity than we did in a lot of classrooms. And so we're thinking that it solves a positive problem and also addresses some of these fraternity issues that everybody's complaining about simultaneously. And there's one other element, there's a lot of talk right now about experiential learning, whatever that is, and how that's the new strategic direction for the college. I see somebody's working already. I had a 16 in a talk I gave at Rocky last week, and at the end of the talk, he said, can I ask a question? President Hanlon has this big strategic initiative about experiential learning. He said, I was in the environmental sciences exam this afternoon, and this consisted of me memorizing a ton of material and trying to remember it long enough to take this test and get most of the questions right. And he said, I did that, and I probably did okay. I probably got an average grade. But I didn't come to Dartmouth to be average. And the experiential learning is what's supposed to be helping me set apart. What are we doing about that? So I don't know what else anybody else is doing, but that's what we're going to be trying to do with this, especially this winter, when we put on more of a continuous series, and we'll be working with people on projects, anything they want to work on as far as some independent work, because I think that's where the experiential learning plays. That's what we always did at Tough. So I'm Gregg Fairbrothers. I am not a SigEp, actually. I'm embarrassed to say I'm a Gamma Del. But Bob Wetzel is a good friend of mine, and he is a SigEp. And he's highly qualified to talk to you about all of those things, particularly collaboration, communication, and critical thinking. He's got a career in that. So I asked Bob to come tonight and basically do two things. One, tell you enough about himself that you can understand what he's going to tell you then about some lessons learned he's accumulated over the years, most of them the hard way. And what I really asked him to do is come and tell you the kind of things he wished he knew when he was sitting in this house back when he was here, or knew as he went along and didn't only until after the fact. Maybe he could spare you at least that mistake, and you could make other mistakes. So with that, Bob, you got maybe 50 minutes for whatever they want to do.
Well, the way we thought we'd start out is let me talk through 15, 20 minutes or so of some background stuff, prepared stuff, and then we can go conversationally and focus on anything that you particularly want to focus on. Gregg talks about the fact that we're going to try and help you avoid some of the mistakes. I'm not sure I want you to. I'm going to help you avoid the mistakes, but I'm going to help you focus potentially on ways to think about making the mistakes in the right way. because that's what experiential learning is about, and that's what ExL, this program, is really designed to, I think, focus on, is trying to give you some ways of thinking about managing and implementing your own experiences to get the best benefit out of it, and to be able to pick up on the signals along the way that those of us old guys didn't necessarily think about. The one thing I when we talk about what did you want to know 40 years ago when you're sitting in this room that you know now, well, it's really how to learn from those experiences, or how to be aware of them, as opposed to having them smack you up the head like a 2x4 as you go along the way. So as we started out, we talked about this about ExL. It's being a focus on 6 kind of core skills that are necessary to entrepreneurship, and we hear great entrepreneurs employing, and we hear employers saying they want to hear about. And Gregg's talked about those a little bit: critical thinking, problem solving, execution or implementation, leadership, collaboration, communication, those 6. Now, it's my personal kind of bias that the first 3, critical thinking, problem solving, execution, or implementation, can generally be taught. I'm talking a minute about the fact that I grew up in the old Arthur Andersen that then became Andersen Consulting, ultimately is what Accenture is today. And I lived through that entire process. And that organization had an extraordinary kind of training, learning culture. You would spend as much as 15% of your total kind of work life each year in training of one form or another. And those are a lot of the kinds of things that we were taught along the way. How to think, how to problem solve, how to actually implement the kinds of projects, design and implement the kind of projects we were going to be doing. The one thing that I don't think we learned, or we were taught, let's say, but we probably learned along the way, and I definitely learned about in my work experience, were the other 3: leadership, collaboration, communication. Those are the things that I think that need to be learned, and learned through experience, in practice, through trial and error, things like that. And so as we move through this program, now, one of the things I'm going to encourage Gregg, and we'll come back to, is we'll kind of talk about the overview a little bit right now, but perhaps come back to more focused kind of programmatic content on some of these things that I think you can actually learn by practicing, by doing. I particularly am focused on and interested in communication. And one of the things I've done in the since I retired about 10 years ago, is develop and teach programs to executives in communication. I've taught every one of Ledyard Bank's kind of senior executives and all the people in their wealth management group communication. I developed a program and did that. Well, maybe we want to come back and do a mini version of that later on in this program, because I will talk a little bit about why I think communication is one of the most undervalued of the skills that an entrepreneur particularly needs to have. So that's what we're going to talk about a little bit today. As I say, 15, 20 minutes kind of background and targeting, and then Gregg and I will kind of converse about this, but also take your questions and interact on some of these issues. So I was asked to perhaps put this in the context of my own experience, so let me give you a little bit of background on that. Some of you have heard it before, but I'll repeat it. I'm a Dartmouth 76 who graduated in 75. The stupidest thing I ever did in my life was give up a year at Dartmouth, but I was a victim of the Dartmouth Plan, which was implemented the year that Gregg and I kind of came to Dartmouth, which is the year that Dartmouth went coeducational. And that was the way, and you probably heard this, but maybe you haven't, that's the way they implemented coeducation, adding women without reducing the number of men. So if you've got a school that can handle 1,000 people, but you want to increase it to 12 or 1,300, 1,000 people 2 terms a year could be increased to 1,300 4 terms a year round, without having to necessarily increase the size of the physical place. So I say I was a victim of the Dartmouth Plan. Graduated in 75, was a little burnt out, went and joined the family business, which was a little insurance company in the Midwest. Ended up spending about 5 years doing just about everything. I spent time in sales and administration, ultimately ran technology, but then decided being a big fish in a very, very small pond was not exactly where I wanted to spend the rest of my life. This was a town of 10,000 people in the Midwest. And the old saying goes, how are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Hanover? I was bigger than Hanover. I did get to see Perry while I was at Dartmouth, not to mention a few other places. So I went to Northwestern, to the Kellogg School, got an MBA in '82 with a focus on finance, marketing, and business strategy. And then given my insurance background, I got hired out of Northwestern by the old, what was then still Arthur Andersen and Company, as they were really beginning to dive into the consulting business. And so I was one of, I think, 8 people who were hired that year to get to 20 in the consulting, what they call the Management Information Consulting Division in Hartford, Connecticut. Hartford, Connecticut was a very big insurance town. I mean, it was, and next to New York, probably the insurance capital of the US, with headquarters for companies like Travelers, Aetna, the Hartford Insurance Group, Hartford Steam Boilers, Cigna, you name it. You know, there were a number of big companies like that. And so I joined to ply my trade in the insurance business and consult to the insurance companies. But of course, naturally, as soon as I arrived, the economy went south. The insurance companies started eliminating all the consulting programs that they were doing, and so you had to scramble to do just about anything you possibly could. And that's one of those places where you really learn flexibility and the ability to just do anything. That's where your thinking, problem solving, execution, collaboration, communication skills allows you to pivot if in fact you think you're going in one direction and the market sends you in a completely different direction. So believe it or not, with 5 years kind of in basically a lifetime growing up in the insurance industry, and 5 years on the ground in a significant insurance company, I ended up making my career at what then quickly became Andersen Consulting in the transportation business. And I became an expert in commuter rail transportation. And working the corridors up and down the Northeast in commuter rail, working for the public sector. Yes, I spent a lot of time in insurance still, but being able to move in that direction, again, pivot using those core skills and not just the specific industry skills, I think was very, very important. It's something to always keep in mind. And then I, basically spent, well, I should say during that time, I would say that I began to become what in the old days we called entrepreneurs. And I think that's still something, a phrase that can be used around. Inside a company, developing entrepreneurial or new kinds of products, services, and things like that, outside of the traditional lines of service. And I did a lot of what I would call entrepreneurship while I was at Arthur Andersen. I developed a big software package working with a client, so working with an insurance industry client. We developed a software package in collaboration with them that we then resold in the marketplace, paying the client a fee, but opening us up to some new clients. We developed a completely new service line in the industry called change management services. This was a point in time in which there was a big focus on organizational change and culture change, using training and education to drive major cultural change through organizations. And so I took leadership role to help develop and implement that practice across the Northeast, again, having some flexibility. And we were one of the early leaders in the development of online and computer-based training by bringing in PhDs. I mean, Arthur Andersen and Andersen Consulting in those days were kind of generally known, and still very much known, for hiring undergrads right out of school, training the hell out of them, and growing them into consultants. But I was really fighting against the organizational curve by pushing to be able to hire PhDs out of instructional technology schools. The premier instructional technology school was Florida State, believe it or not. Those were the guys at Florida State were the ones who effectively created the Korean educational system. And so the world's best PhDs in what was called instructional technology or instructional design at that point were coming out of Florida State. We hired about 5 of them and blew up this practice, amazing practice in computer-based training and instructional design and technology. We'll come back and talk about that. Collaboration, thinking outside the box. How do you bring people into an organization and have them working in a more traditional organization doing non-traditional things? I then got assigned to work with development partners, other software companies, because of the project that we had done working with the client and creating some software. So we started building more and new and different products that we could leverage across our service lines. And finally, I guess I would say I got caught doing kind of too much of that because I was having beers with by that time I'd become a partner, and I was having a few beers with one of my partners, or a couple of my partners one evening, and I started exclaiming over the Heineken in German. And 6 weeks later, I found myself in Frankfurt for the next 6 years, and in Europe for the next 8 years. But again, it was a matter of being open to new opportunity, being able to pivot. My language experience and training, something I would never have thought that I would use in my business experience, had to end up building an insurance practice in all of the German-speaking countries, which I did across the 90s. But I spent half my career in Hartford, half my career overseas. So I think the point is, you don't have to be an entrepreneur externally, you can be an entrepreneur internally, but the skills still apply. And the skills are, in many ways, one of the most important things. So let's talk about those 3 kind of key ones that I was mentioning, that I would talk about tonight, and some of my own experiences in how do you kind of stay focused on leadership, collaboration, communication, and what are the things you can learn and apply as you go on, and pick up on them as you are seeing them along the way. First of all, leadership. Obviously, you've read plenty about leadership. Leadership styles take many, many different forms. The critical part of leadership style is, can you recognize and understand what your own style is, and then adapt the way you operate to that style, because everybody's got a different style. You pick it up along the way. It's based on your life experience, it's based on your education, it's based on your family experience and things like that. There was an interesting article in just this past weekend's Wall Street Journal. I don't know if anybody see this one, the 4 species of entrepreneurs or entrepreneurship. It's in the weekend Wall Street Journal, which I've now decided is better than the weekend New York Times, the Sunday New York Times in a lot of cases. Particularly the review section is really fascinating, and it's got great stuff in it, which is where this was. In any case, it talks about 4 different styles of entrepreneurial leadership. And I'll just run through those, and then I'll talk about some other styles. They talk about, one of those styles is the diamond, if you will. The classic diamond, a charismatic evangelist. Who would you say is kind of the greatest known diamond of the last kind of 25 years? Steve Jobs, absolutely. But a guy who creates this extraordinary vision, bends kind of reality to his own vision, if you will, but does it by trampling over everybody. I mean, Steve Jobs was frankly pretty much hated by his own employees, including his leadership team, because it's always about him. It was always my way or the highway. And so if you are, in fact, a diamond, that doesn't make you a bad person. In fact, that makes you incredibly valuable. But you need to learn how to share the credit, to listen to other people, and to be able to take criticism. Because without that, you're just going to blow the whole thing up because everybody's going to hate you and walk away and go work for somebody else. The second style, dynamic trendsetters, people who set the trends along the way. The example that they used of the dynamic trendsetter is Richard Branson, for example. Now, these are guys who are very focused on setting the design. Everything's about them and them kind of leading from the front. But what they tend to forget about is you can lead from the front, but somebody's got to do the logistics in the background. And so you need to, if you are a star, a dynamic trendsetter, you have to think about hiring people to do the boring stuff, if you will. You have to think about delivery and implementation. And you have to be aware of flattery, because if you're one of those guys, that's what you want to hear. You want to hear it's about me, right? And I want to hear people talking about me. But if you just got a lot of people who are talking about me, there's no one attending to the knitting, as my grandmother used to say. So that's another style. There are the transformers, the catalysts for social and cultural change. The example that's used is Howard Schultz, who created Starbucks. Here's a guy who kind of created a new cultural infrastructure, because before that time, we got our coffee from Folgers, we cooked it in our pots at home, and we paid 2 cents a cup for it. Now we're paying $2 a cup because we have to go sit in a coffee shop to get a much better product and kind of understand that it's creating a cultural experience. It's not just about drinking a cup of coffee. But those people who drive such kind of strong social cultural change tend to have this very huge vision of what they want it to be. But the strategy has to match the vision. And so if you can't implement, if you can't drive strategy from the vision that you have, it's going to crash and burn. The other thing that they say is those transformers don't tend to focus on the data. It's like, don't confuse me with the facts, my mind's made up. You have to be able to understand the facts and understand what the facts and the data is telling you. On the absolute opposite side of that, though, are what this article called the rocket ships. These are the analysts, the tinkerers, the guys who kind of want to make the most perfect system known to man. So who's the guy who's created the most perfect system, if you will, in the last 25 years, that we all use on a daily basis?
Bezos?
Bezos, yeah. Jeff Bezos is the guy that they target. And those are the guys who just want to break it down, make it every little thing incrementally better. But what they tend to do is lose sight of the big idea. They're so deep down inside the guts of the process that they lose sight of the big idea. So a rocket ship, that kind of analyst or tinkering leader, has to be able to have creative people around him who he's willing to listen to, and understand that qualitative data and emotion is almost as good as, or is in many cases as good as, or as important as the quantitative data and the pure analytical outputs. So, there are some ideas of understanding yourself, and as you work through this process, know what kind of a leader you are. People want to follow a leader, but you have to decide and determine and understand what the kind of leader is that you're going to be. Now, my own style of leadership, I tended to be a coach and an idea generator. Now, how do I know that? Well, in the 90s in Europe and pretty much across the world, particularly in the consulting businesses and kind of the big Fortune 500 companies, this whole issue, the whole thing of psychological testing to define kind of leadership style was all the rage. And so we were all going through these endless psychological tests. And then we'd have to meet with a consultant who would debrief us on what our particular leadership or style was. And then we have to assemble teams based on relative styles. In many cases, I'm kind of speaking down to it, but it worked. And I realized after the fact that, I actually was a coach. That was my style. I didn't have a big ego. I didn't always have to be in the front. I tended to be one who had the bigger idea, but had to bring people together as a team to implement those kinds of ideas. It can really be a kick in the gut for you if you think you're of one style and you get the psychological test that says you're another style. So you have to be very careful about not overreacting to it, number one, taking the input that you get from outsiders, whether it be people that you're working with, whether it be a psychological test or something like that, and make sure that you really understand and can match the perception to what's going on. Keep that in mind as you work through teams. Everybody, you have to have all types of leaders and all types of people on a team for it to work. Football team's got to have a quarterback. It's got to have wide receivers. Those are the big ego guys who kind of lead from the front, but you aren't going to go anywhere unless you've got some offensive linemen who are willing to protect those guys and make it happen. And across the board, who gets, you've heard about the Wonderlic test that they give at the football combine. Across the board, who gets the highest scores on the Wonderlic test by position? Kicker, quarterback. Offensive lineman. The offensive linemen are, across the board, consistently the smartest guys on the team. And as such, they tend to be able to subvert their ego, understand their role, and in many cases, they're among the most highly paid because it's their job to protect the big ego leader, right? The transformer, or the diamond, if you will, and make sure that things can get implemented in the process. It's one way of thinking about a team building, team structure. And so, as I said, you've got to discover your own style and you've got to leverage it. You've got to make sure that you're leveraging and using that style to the best way possible. In my case, as I say, I was a coach. And so I tended to use this mantra that variously attributed to Harry Truman or Ronald Reagan. I've seen exactly the same quote attributed to both guys. So I'm guessing Reagan stole it from Truman, right? Like he did a lot of other stuff. In any case, the quote is, "It's amazing what you can accomplish if you don't care who gets the credit." Well, that's what a coach was about. And so that was my goal as I was coming through that process. Building teams with complementary skills, encouraging and rewarding collaboration, and then sitting back and letting it run, letting other people take credit, whatever it might be. Because ultimately, if you're the one who kind of kicked it off, you're going to get what you are supposed to get in the process. So that's a few thoughts on leadership and keeping in mind, what is your leadership style and how do you go there? Second thing we wanted to talk about was collaboration. Nobody has a monopoly on good ideas and capabilities. And so the concept of collaboration is just like I was talking about in the coach concept, bringing those different players together to leverage their skills, to optimize the capabilities of all the people involved, and ultimately drive a better result. Now, when I was inside Accenture, I was leveraging, and what I was doing was what I would call internal collaboration. So we would bring people from multiple offices together with the best skills and the best capabilities to drive a particular project. I also had lots of external collaborations that I was working on. You work with clients. They could bring the on-the-ground experience with what they were doing on a daily basis. We could bring the organization, design, and implementation to that and ultimately deliver a product that would meet complementary clients' kinds of needs and be able to sell that in the marketplace. You can also do it with competitors in many cases. And so I worked with a number of companies who conceivably could be considered competitors. I worked with McKinsey. I worked with PeopleSoft, which was a big software company at that point in time, who would like to do their own implementations. They didn't like us to do their implementations. But we ultimately were able to come out with by focusing on what in the old days we called the WIFM, what's in it for me. And if you focus on that benefit that everyone can get, you are optimizing a greater end result by bringing those different players together in collaboration. I had a project in Switzerland that I think is really an excellent example of collaboration. We had multi-languages, multi-skills, multi-companies. We had Accenture, McKinsey, PeopleSoft, and a couple of other, or not McKinsey, or not PeopleSoft, but SAP in that case, which was the big European software company in that case. On that project, we spoke French, German, Swiss, Italian, Spanish, and English. And what we did, because we had so many people who kind of spoke to each other in their same language, and then across, we tried to take, or one of my goals was to turn what I call bilateral relationships into multilateral relationships. Excuse me. So to identify the people who could speak German and Italian, and English, let's say, and bring the Italian and German together with the English speakers, or French and Italian, or French and Swiss. And you may not realize that Swiss is actually an independent language, kind of a derivative of German. And by doing that, you're clearly kind of maximizing and multiplying the values that can come out of it. So collaboration ultimately bringing the best people together and encouraging them, showing them what the benefits are for each of them of working together. Finally, let's talk a moment about communication. As I mentioned earlier, I think communication is probably the most undervalued skill in entrepreneurship. If you cannot communicate your idea effectively, you are not going to succeed. I've been a part of a angel investor group for about 6 or 8 years that's here in Hanover. And I've probably listened to 100 and 150 pitches during that time from people who are literally coming in and asking for investment. They're looking for my money. And I cannot tell you how many times a tremendous idea was just dead in the water because the people could not communicate what that idea was about. And they could not communicate why you would want to have confidence in them implementing that idea using your money. And my view is, if you can't communicate it to me, the guy who's going to put money into this process, and who has a relatively decent kind of experience and understanding of the kinds of things that you're trying to do, how are you going to communicate it to the customers who are going to have to buy it, the marketplace that's going to have to invest further, et cetera, et cetera. And so I really think that we undervalue and we ignore communication skills at our peril. Communication clearly demonstrates confidence, it demonstrates understanding, it demonstrates a proactive point of view about moving through, about doing what you're doing. And I think that I'll finish by talking about what I think are the effective communication skills, or the things that you really need to be thinking about if you're effectively communicating. Now, I've got a 6-week course that I've built around, the things that I'm going to talk about in the next 2 minutes, and perhaps we come back to that at some point in the future. But effective communication involves, in my mind, the following. Number one, practice. Take every opportunity that you possibly can to speak in public. The more you do it, the better you get, the easier it gets. You stumble at first, but you learn from those stumbles, and you get better and better and better. If you can't have those opportunities to do it, then when you do get the chance, rehearse. Rehearse, rehearse, rehearse. Actually do it in front of the mirror. Actually, there are crazy ways to do things like this. You can rehearse by reading stories. it sounds silly, but one of the first things I do in one of my communications classes is I give them a children's book and say, imagine you were reading this to your child. And then we talk about how they actually communicate. Dick and Jane went to the store and they wanted to buy some groceries. It's the most boring, and I record them and play it back. It's the most boring thing on the face of the earth. I mean, the kids gone and not listening and stuff like that. So rehearse. And take the opportunities for education, for training in communication to the extent you can. So practice number one. Preparation number two. Do your research, right? Obviously know all the things you need to know about developing the presentation, what you're going to talk about, what the issues are, things like that. If it's as simple as a toast that you're going to give at a wedding, to as complex as a 40-page kind of deck that you're going to deliver to a bunch of angels to raise some money, do your research. Know something about the groom. You think you know him because you grew up with him and things like that. But ask around and find out some more. Then design the presentation appropriately. Spend some time thinking about what that presentation needs to look like and how you're going to go about doing it. And then think about what your presentation approach is going to be. Are you just putting up slides? Are you speaking just kind of casually like this to deliver the information? Do you need to have collaterals that go along with it? So preparation. Third is precision. I cannot tell you how many of these presentations I've sat through in which there are 20 slides used to say what can be done in 3. Or there is a page of data to get across 2 or 3 points. One of the things I always say is if you never have more than 3 bullet points on a page. People think in 3s. So break it down into the rule of 3s. If you need to go beyond 3, then break it down to the next kind of 3 bullet points. But keep your message clear. Clarity of message. Stay focused. You don't need to provide a lot of extraneous information. Figure out what the key points in each of the things that you're about to say are all about, and keep it as simple as you possibly can. So precision. Fourth is audience analysis. People very rarely think about who's the audience. I'm going to stand up and I'm going to say what I want you to know. Well, what about the people that you're talking to? What do they want to know from you? And so if you're giving a pitch to an angel group, that's very different than giving a pitch to a venture capitalist. You may think they're the same, but they're not. And they've got very different kind of points of view. And they've got very different experiences. Much less if you're giving a presentation to a class as opposed to a group of senior citizens, let's say, or something like that. So understand the makeup of the audience. One of the components of my course is a full kind of week's session, a full session on just doing audience analysis, understanding who the audience is going to be. Understand what their language is, meaning how do they talk? What's the nature of the way that they talk, they think? What's their experience? So that if you're using kind of technical language with a non-technical audience, you've lost them from the moment you start. And then always be aware of timing and expectations. If you've been given 10 minutes for a pitch and you go 15, I'm sorry, you're gone. You have wasted my time, you have ignored my expectations, and you have insulted my intelligence. If you've got 10 minutes, make it 10 minutes. Understand what your expectations of your audience are when you do that. And then finally, focus on the fifth is delivery skills. Understand that what competence you need to be able to deliver. Understand about vocal skills. It's back to the issue that I raised right in the beginning about reading a book to a child. Think of giving a speech, think of public speaking like singing, right? You vary the tempo, you vary the volume. You go up and down, you rise and fall in phrasing. That's very important in public speaking. Also then focus on body language and think about body language. Don't be boring standing up there. Move around, engage with your audience. And then think about kind of language and word choice. That's back to kind of talking about understanding your audience and knowing what they want to hear. Let me conclude by saying, when we talk about public speaking and I talk about engaging people with communication, one of the phrases that I always use is you're projecting confidence. Now, you can be often wrong, but never be in doubt in speaking to a group. It will take you a long way. Okay, so there's what I think are the ways you begin to think about those three key kind of skills, the 3 of the 6 core skills that you can in fact learn experientially, and you must learn experientially. But hopefully you get a little bit of a head start by thinking about how to go about doing that. Let me stop there and kind of we'll either take some questions or Greg and I will converse based on kind of what his experience.
No question.
Yeah.
Well, sure. You talked about entrepreneurship.
Right.
I guess in your example, and most examples I've heard have been like, even though your firm was pretty big, this consulting practice was small. So how can like an individual who a lot of us have gone into like big banks or very established consulting firms still make a difference if everything's already in place and it's like a low level?
Well, I would respond by saying, respond to your point that everything is in place. Everything is never in place. There's always something that can and needs to be done, and can be used to leverage the skills and experience of whatever organization you're in, finance, consulting, manufacturing, whatever it might be. And so we go back to my experience in building the change management practice at what was then Anderson Consulting. This was a huge opportunity for us. We were doing a lot of technology design and development and implementation, but the ability to implement and deliver that technology once we designed and built it we were finding was failing at not a significant rate, but at an unacceptable rate. And so the ability to deliver it through technology, through training, through instruction, and then building that instruction ultimately into the technology we're building was an extremely important thing. I can't remember precisely how I recognized that. I certainly know that I was in a couple of failed projects. And then I started looking around, and maybe it was on a plane that I bumped into one of these PhDs, and we started chatting. It's like a light goes on or something like that. But always look for what's the value added that's going to take us to the next level. And then do a little research and bring that forward. That's what entrepreneurship is about in that case. It's leveraging your existing skill base to expand capabilities and take it to the next level. And just because you're at a low level doesn't mean you don't have good ideas. And one of my experiences is, yes, you'll be among other Ivy Leaguers and other graduates who've got great skills, but the fact that you went to Dartmouth, the fact that you've got that little bit of pedigree allows you to bring an idea forward with a little bit more, let's say, gravitas, a little bit more acceptance than you might get if you were just some other guy. Figure out your idea, do your research, understand what the value is it's going to bring, and then take that to kind of the next level up, or a couple of levels up, and give it a try.
And don't be afraid to let it be their idea.
Well, of course, absolutely.
So,
We're back to my point about, you can accomplish amazing things and you don't have to get the credit. And it was never my practice, right? Yes, I built it. Yes, I helped hire those people. Yes, I promoted them into the organization, etc. But I never thought about it as my practice. That's the nature of how I looked at it. It was our practice. And it was going to drive kind of greater business for our organization. Thank you.
You're either a procedure follower or you're somebody thinking for yourself. Thinking for yourself, you're entrepreneurial. You can do that in any setting. You see an opportunity, you act on it, you figure out what needs to be done, and you con people into doing it. And that's how change happens inside even a big organization. That's why it really doesn't matter what the setting is, how you do it.
Agreed.
What else? Sure.
I'd love to hear a little bit about, it sounds like you moved back and forth between the insurance industry, working in kind of the technological side of consulting, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you think leadership and communication play into the technological side versus the business side.
Well, again, it's a matter of kind of understanding and identifying what your leadership's style is and capabilities, and those of the people around you. But most of the time, as you're probably aware, what Accenture was doing, in probably 75% of its business at one point in time, was design and delivery of technology. So, the key there is design, in my mind. For me, it was. Because I tended to be a designer. I was not a great implementer. Yes, I coded. Yes, I kind of went to the coding school, and there were a couple of points in time where I asked myself, what am I doing here? I was a Dartmouth graduate who then went on and spent 5 years in a decent-sized insurance company, rising in that 5 years to an executive level position. Then went to what was at that point one of the top 2 or 3 business schools in the country. Graduated Beta Gamma, which is the honorary society, and joined Arthur Andersen in Hartford, Connecticut, and immediately got assigned to go write COBOL code under a 2-year kind of a graduate out of undergrad, the University of Connecticut, 2 years ago. So she was 24, I was 29. And she was my coding supervisor. And there were a few days in that process when I didn't ask myself, what the hell are you doing? But of course I had 2 children and a mortgage and a wife, and just bought a house and moved to Hartford, Connecticut, and it's like, well, I'm kind of trapped, so you better put your head down and do something. But the something was continually focusing on design concept, on kind of what could we do better, as opposed to focusing down, as Gregg says, follow procedure, which I could have just kept my head down and write code. So in that technology environment, my ability to kind of move back and forth across industries, being able to, as I call it, pivot, if you will, was the ability in my mind to be, number one, an idea generator. Number two, a collaborator to bring people who could help implement those ideas and who are comfortable doing that, who weren't comfortable necessarily communicating to senior executives, being an idea generator, etc. They were very comfortable, or much more comfortable, delivering the products that we were designing. And so everybody's kind of got the skill, and it's a matter of finding where you fit in the team. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Respond to the question?
We got time for maybe one more. We promised them 6 o'clock. I think it's midterms this week, right?
It is.
Anything else?
Gregg, you started mentioning that one of the reasons you did this in fraternities is because you guys are fraternity men, and you wanted to, and you recognize that fraternities are sort of a leadership petri dish. And our fraternity in particular prides itself on having a leadership development program. And I wonder if you can talk either about your own experience as you were Gamma Delta. Not that I want to talk too much about Gamma Delta, or more importantly, Bob's experience as a leader in the chapter, some of the things, because it's my firm belief that as much as I learned from my Dartmouth classes, some of the greatest opportunities I had to learn how to do things was as the VP of programming for Sigma Phi Epsilon, and hosting events like this as an undergrad, and and I didn't do it with the cool technology we have today. But can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I think I was 17 when I came to Dartmouth, and didn't rush fraternity. Call came at the end of my freshman year. I was sitting at home, and I got a call from guys that worked for the radio station. They said, "Hey, we're Gamma Delta." And we're cleaning this house up. It's been a drug house. And we're wondering if you want to clean the house. And
I see it reverted.
No,
just kidding.
And I said, and by the way, we need a house manager to help clean the house up. And we think you'd be a great house manager. Would you like to live in the house and be the house manager? I didn't have a lot of money. Well, I'll live in the house and save money. I said, yeah. So I joined the fraternity. So I'm not your normal fraternity guy to begin with, and I'm not your normal house manager either. But I got in there and I said, they want to clean the house up. And it was a mess. It was bad. And so I said, well, WTF, what am I going to do with this thing? So I got everybody together and I said, okay, we're all going to clean it up. Yeah, I want to clean it up. I said, fine, you're going to all volunteer, right? Yeah, we're all going to volunteer. They said, great. And if you don't do your cleanup job, I can fine you, right? And they're like, I don't know about the fine thing. So they voted on that and they said, yep, $20, which would be about like $100 today if you didn't do your job. So I went out and from the house meeting and I pinned a yellow sheet on the bulletin board, call it the rag sheet. I said, I'm gonna rag you guys if you don't do it. And I put all the jobs down and I said, sign up. And if you don't sign up, I'm signing you up. So of course, the guys who didn't want the fines were the ones who didn't sign up and they got the bathrooms. Didn't do it, went through the big thing, big house meeting. Then there was a whole Supreme Court appeal over the fines. This went on for 2 years that I was the house manager. We did clean that house up. I'm going to tell you that I learned more about how to get lazy sons of bitches to do their jobs and clean a house up, how to keep a house clean, how to clean up after party nights, that kind of thing. In those 2 years, than just about anything I could have possibly done in the classroom. Because I had to get people to do things with no power other than that fine. And every time the fine survey was, Supreme Court hearing and House meeting for 2 hours arguing over it, right? So that was what was the genesis of getting some guys to come into the house like Bob and talk about this stuff. And I've had Jeff Immelt in here. I've had John Donahoe, the president of eBay. He's going to come winter or spring. Sherry Ober is going to talk next week. She's at Kappa and going to speak at Kappa. 20 years flogging a medical device company, probably blew through $300 million to get it public, and is now working on an education nonprofit. And all of us think about this question of where do we really learn this stuff? Because you cannot learn this in a book. You really can't learn too much about hearing. You've got to do it. And you start out by picking a problem and just taking it on and figuring out how to get people to work together. With the very things Bob was telling you, communication skills, getting people to collaborate. A lot of times they don't really want to. And it's all about the communication in the end. Sometimes we're just going to find your actually go do his job. Sometimes it's a lot more subtle, like, the reasons why we're going to do these things, why we're working together. That's one testimony and one example. You probably have something. So, yeah.
Well, it's not a great example because, as I said, I was a victim of the Dartmouth plan, so I missed an entire year of fraternity life, and during my junior year, I was really pounding to finish. Once my father discovered the Dartmouth plan, and that if I had one extra class in each of 2 terms, he could save an entire year's tuition. That was kind of a motivating factor, shall we say. I was rush chairman, however, in my junior year, and in doing that, I think it was clear that we understood what we wanted the house to look like. And so it was a matter of raising that vision, understanding what that vision was going to be, and then starting to put the pieces together. Okay, if this is the vision we want, who do we have to go out and recruit to be able to effectively implement that vision? And it was a real microcosm. Remember, we were 19 or 20 years old, so let's not kind of call ourselves rocket scientists at that point in time. Except maybe Gregg, who kind of cleaned up the house. But we did have a concept that we were trying to implement. We went out and did it, and we brought the people together who could actually do that.
It's experiential. It's doing something as opposed to just
Exactly.
So, anything else? We thought I cut it out and we get you guys to the library. I'm sure you wanted to study, right?
I'll give you the tour. I'll give you the tour of this house.
All right, thank you guys.
Thanks, everyone.